Hey and welcome back. So in today's video I'm going to be showing you how I edit this underwater photo from this to an end result that looks something like this. And I'll quickly put up on the screen right now the settings in the camera gear that I used to take this photo, and then we'll get right into the editing process. To start off with, we're going to scroll all the way to the bottom of the right hand bar and we are going to click on the enable lens correction. And your Lightroom should automatically select the lens for you, but if it doesn't, you can search your lens here and do a correct lens correction. And then next we're going to start off with the light section of the editing. So for this photo I think the exposure can be left alone because it's correctly exposed, but if your photo is too dark I would drag the bar to the right and put the exposure up, but this one I'm going to leave at 0. And then I'm going to add some contrast. Decrease the highlights a little, increase the shadows a tiny bit to bring out some details in the background. And then overall the photo is a little bit too bright, so I'm going to put the whites down and then add some of the blacks to add a bit of contrast to the image. And this is the first section done. And this part isn't so important for the underwater photos. You kind of adjust this according to the original image that you took, so your sections might look a little bit different. Next we're moving on to the point curve section, and here we're just going to add a gentle S-curve to add a little more contrast and pop to the image. So we're going to drag down the shadows at the bottom, click again in the middle and put the point around at about 0 here, and then click another point at the top side and increase the highlights up to kind of bring out the bright parts of the image a little bit. And then I think this gentle S-curve is good for this photo, but you can also always make it a bit more steep if you want to add more contrast, but I will put it back to here for now. And then next we're moving on to the color grading of this photo, which I think is the most important part for the underwater photos, and it kind of changes how the end photo is going to look the most. So for most underwater photos there's going to be a little bit too much green and blues in the photo. So I'm going to start by adjusting the temperature bar to the right towards the yellows, and then if I adjust it to the yellows it's going to be pretty strong in the greens. So I'm also going to adjust the tint to the right, and as you can see this already looks a lot better. And I think a lot of the underwater photos that you see on Instagram have these really kind of strong whites and light blues, so this is usually how they get this kind of colours after the original photo, which tends to look a little bit more green. And because we brought the purples up, we have some unwanted highlights which look completely purple. So next we're going to go down to the color mixer and adjust the individual colors here. So we don't want purples and pinks in underwater photos as they're colors that don't exist, or as they're colors that you don't really see very often and it doesn't look very natural. So I'm going to drag the pink hue all the way to the left. So this will change them all to a more darker purple. And then next I'm going to drag all the purples to the left again into the blues, and also decrease the saturation a bit. And this will remove all of the strong pinks and purples from the image. And I'm actually going to make sure that the saturation is 0 for both of these colors for this image. And then next we're going to move on to the blues. But I think the overall kind of color of this image I like already, so I'm not going to change this too much. You can always adjust the tint to a more turquoise by moving it to the left, and a darker tone of blue by moving it to the right. But I think I'm going to stick to this color, maybe up the saturation of the blues just a tiny bit, like this, and increase the luminance. And you kind of want to change the tone of the blue depending on the feeling you want to give off from the photo. So this is kind of more of a bright and happy kind of looking image, so I'm going to be increasing the exposure. But if I wanted a more dark and moody underwater shot, then I would decrease the luminance and saturation and make a bunch of other changes to make the image look a bit more darker. And then the rest of the colors in this image, it's not too important to adjust. You can play around with it a little bit. So I'm going to move the blues and greens to the right so we get a stronger blue. The greens I'm going to leave as is, I think, as there's not many greens in the image now. Yellows, it doesn't make a difference either, so I'm going to leave these unchanged. So that's going to be it for the color grading portion of this photo, and next we're going to move down to the effects section. So now we're moving on to the effects section of the editing process, and for this photo I really wanted to give off this kind of dreamy underwater feel, so I actually moved the texture of the image all the way down to the left, and it gives off like a really soft kind of more dreamy look, whereas if you increase the texture to all the way to the right, it gives up a much sharper looking image, but I don't really like it for this photo, so I'm going to move it all the way to the left, around about here. And I'm actually going to do the same for the clarity. With all of the tropical fish and the jellyfish kind of in the foreground and background, I think this gives off a better kind of feeling for this photo. So the clarity I've moved to the left slightly, and then I'm going to increase the dehaze to the right to make the color of the background a bit darker, like this. And I'm starting to like how the image looks already. So if you click on this button at the bottom right, you can see the before and after. So this is before and this is after at this point. And I think that this photo already is looking pretty good, so you can end the process here. But there is a couple more things that you can do. The first thing I'm going to do is bring down the vignette slightly, the midpoint all the way to the left so it's in the middle, and then drag the feather all the way to the right so it's not too noticeable. And then the noise reduction and color noise reduction, I'm going to move up to about 50 for both. And we're done with the main section of the editing, and the last thing I'm going to do is add a couple of masks. And the first thing I'm going to do is add a linear gradient, and because the sunlight is coming from the top to bottom, the bottom half of the image is a little bit too bright for my liking, so I'm going to create a mask overlay that looks like this. And the red portion of the image is the part which gets affected, so I'm going to invert so that the bottom half of the image is where it's going to get affected. And then I am going to decrease the exposure very slightly, like this. And then I'm going to add a separate radial gradient at the top of the image to kind of make the top half of the image a little bit brighter, like this. I think that this is going to be it for this editing process, so let me show you the final photo quickly right now. And my favorite thing about using Lightroom to kind of edit your photos is that there's so many ways you can edit a single photo. So I actually edited this photo in a couple of different ways, so here are a couple more end results. And for this one I just added a little bit more contrast and made the overall tone of blue a bit darker, so it gives off a different feeling to the original image that we just edited. And I think the more you play around with all of the Lightroom editing tools, the better you're going to get at kind of giving off a certain feel to your photos. So I recommend you keep practicing and trying out different edits with the same photo over and over until you start to get the hang of it. And I think that is going to be it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video.